Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Jetrel, which is episode 14 of season 1 of Star Trek Voyager. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as requested by my viewers. This episode was requested by Stephen Lilac. So Jetrel was the episode where Voyager is contacted by a Harkonian named Jetrel, who specifically asks to speak to Neelix. Neelix explains that the Harkonians have conquered his home planet by setting off a powerful weapon of mass destruction on the moon colony Neelix was from, Rhinax, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, including all of Neelix's family, and apparently Jetrel was the head scientist that created this weapon. So Neelix is very openly hostile towards Jetrel, but Jetrel tries to warn Neelix he could have a fatal disease caused by the after effects of this weapon, and that he is here to examine him and help him. After Jetrel examines Neelix, he does determine he has the fatal disease, and so he comes up with a brilliant solution to cure the disease, which involves going back to Rhinax to collect samples of the poisonous cloud and use Voyager's transporter systems to separate the molecules and somehow find a cure. Meanwhile, Neelix and Jetrel continue to not get along as Jetrel tries to express how guilty he feels about the loss of life he was responsible for, but Neelix refuses to forgive him. And after a series of nightmares, Neelix confesses to Kes that he lied about why he wasn't on Rhinax at the time the weapon was used, as he told her he was training with the Defense Forces, but in actuality he was a conscientious objector who was hiding from the Defense Forces because he refused to fight. And thus we realize that Neelix is transferring much of the guilt he feels about his own actions onto Jetrel, which is why he hates him so much. So when Voyager attempts the experiment, Jetrel knocks out Neelix and disables the Doctor and takes control of Voyager's transporters for his own purposes. At first the crew suspects something nefarious, but then discover that Jetrel is actually trying to reconstruct those lost in the blast and bring them back to life. Once Janeway realizes what he's doing, she decides to help him, but his experiment doesn't work. And at this stage, Jetrel only has a few days left to live as he's succumbing to his own disease, and he realizes he reveals that Neelix isn't sick and is perfectly healthy, and it was all pretense just to get them back to Rhinax so he could try to bring back to life those he killed. And on his deathbed, Neelix finally forgives Jetrel for what he's done. So first thing I have to say about this episode is that it is an inescapable conclusion to me that this episode was trying to replicate some of the magic of the much revered Deep Space Nine episode Duet, which had aired just 2 years prior to this one. Duet was the episode where Major Kira interrogates a Cardassian suspected of being an infamous war criminal. The similarities were very apparent to me even when I first watched this, as both episodes are the penultimate episode of season 1, and both are highly dramatic bottle episodes that rely mostly on dialogue rather than action sequences, and both used World War II metaphors. In fact, in my recent research for this episode, it is stated that it was a conscious decision to recapture some of the magic from Duet by the writers, as they saw how successful that episode was with Deep Space Nine. In fact, apparently there was another script that dealt with Neelix's backstory that was being considered alongside this one, but ultimately this one was chosen because it was a bottle episode and cheaper to do. So those familiar with my channel will know that Duet is not only my favorite Deep Space Nine episode, but also my favorite Star Trek episode of all time. So I do hold it in very high esteem indeed. Now, as for Jetrel copying it, I must admit when I first saw this episode, I was very dismissive of it for that reason and didn't pay that much attention to it. However, when I did go back and revisit it and gave it a fair shake, I did find it had many unique qualities in its own right that make it an outstanding episode. In fact, those who have seen my top 10 Voyager episode videos will know that this did make my top 10 and is in fact one of my favorite Voyager episodes. Watching this episode again reminds me of why I preferred the first two seasons of Voyager to the later seasons. They have a certain magic that was a bit lost in the later seasons that were trying too hard to appeal to mass audiences. In particular, where this episode is concerned, you can see Neelix used to be a more complex character with many different facets. In fact, in season 1 overall, he was a bit more antagonistic and suspicious, whereas in later seasons they turned him into a fun-loving goofball without much intelligence nor dynamic. And of course, Kes, who I loved in seasons 1 and 2, they had completely ruined her character in season 3 to the point where they had to write her off the show. And part of what ruined her character was having her break up with Neelix for no good reason so she could be free to pursue this cringe-worthy romance with Tom Paris. And you get the height of how well Kes and Neelix's relationship worked in this episode, where she had a sort of wisdom that helped Neelix, and that she was able to see beyond the layers of facade that Neelix put on to keep others at bay. So they're actually quite a cute relationship, and I thought it worked very well, particularly in this episode. And what makes this episode so great in particular is that it's a great character study of Neelix on how he has this very justifiable anger at Jetrel, who is by all accounts a war criminal, and Neelix witnessed the effects of his device firsthand, adding to the horror. But then we learned that most of Neelix's anger was him deflecting his own insecurities and feelings of guilt for not having participated in the war. And the way that this played out was amazingly done, with dream sequences and metaphors of the pool table tactic, safety. It was just used very well. First of all, typically when episodes had a teaser with them playing pool on the holodeck or something like that, it's usually just a fun aside that's ultimately just a waste of time, not really relevant to the rest of the episode. However, in this episode, it was a perfect metaphor about how Neelix loved to play things safe and how he felt guilty over this. And the dream sequence where Jetrel was being the villain and Neelix wanted to attack him, but he found that he was actually attacking himself, was amazing, as was the part of it where Neelix saw Kes as a burned girl that Neelix discovered after the massacre. Now, typically I'm not a fan of these hokey dream sequences. However, I think this one really worked very effectively in this episode, so much so it's ultimately what convinced me that this is one of the best episodes of Voyager. And also should be mentioned, the performances in this episode were amazing, and I dare say this was Ethan Phillips' best performance in the entire series, and it is indeed one of the Ethan Phillips' favorite personal episodes. And overall, the chemistry he had with the Jetrel character was amazing, and the scenes with the two of them together worked so well, and I dare say they were powerful enough to rival those seen in Duet. And James Slonian, his performance as Jetrel was also amazing. Of course, Slonian was at this stage already a veteran in Star Trek, having given an equally powerful performance as Admiral Jirok in the Next Generation episode The Defector, and also had appeared as a future version of Worf's son Alexander, and as the Bajoran scientist that raised Odo, Dr. Mara, on Deep Space Nine. And at first it was a bit hard for me to buy him as Jetrel, because I was already so familiar with this actor and all these other various Star Trek roles, but ultimately he becomes Jetrel in this episode, and yes, his performance was amazing, so it's definitely worth it to get this actor again. And the ending of this episode was also really powerful, as it deals not only with Neelix coming to terms with why he's angry at Jetrel, but also how Jetrel has become so overwhelmed with guilt that he went to ridiculous lengths to try to undo some of the damage he's done, and to see the desperation and his pleas to Janeway to allow him to conduct his experiments was so powerful. And it was very effective storytelling that Jetrel's experiments did fail, because it didn't in fact make it more powerful, as if they succeeded it would have felt a bit too happy, a bit too hokey. But the simple fact that he tried speaks volumes of his character overall, and the toll of what he had done had taken on him. And the final scene where Neelix forgives him on his deathbed was indeed extremely powerful, and one of the most touching scenes in the entire series. So, like Duet, this episode features obvious metaphors to World War II era historical events. However, what's interesting, as opposed to Duet, which likened the villains, the Cardassians, to the Nazis, Jetrel actually based the antagonists, the Halconians, off of the United States, as the Cascade weapon that the Halconians used on Rhinox was an obvious metaphor for the atomic bombs the United States used on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In particular, the character of Jetrel was directly based off of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was instrumental in creating the atomic bomb that was used on Japan. In fact, several Oppenheimer quotes were used directly as dialogue spoken by Jetrel, and the writers recall doing a lot of research on the atomic blast of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in preparation for writing this episode, and the writers described doing all that research as very depressing. However, it is clear that Jetrel is not portrayed as a straight-up villain and is depicted as showing a lot of guilt and regret that Oppenheimer isn't noted as ever portraying. And it could be argued that the Halconians aren't portrayed as straight-up villains, and some of the blame is placed on the Talaxians, as Neelix describes their reasons for going to war with the Halconians as unjust. So this only leads to the dynamic of the overall episode. It doesn't present things in terms of black and white and good and evil, and has many complexities, and it leads to a very thought-provoking and overall powerful story. However, where I think this episode falls a bit short, particularly when compared to Duet, is that unlike Duet, that uses established Star Trek races and events, this episode writes its own history, making up characters and events as it goes. This is what made me feel the most disconnected when I first watched this episode, as it felt like the show was throwing all this intense exposition at me while at the same time expecting me to be emotionally affected by it. It would have helped had they established Neelix's backstory before this episode, as prior to this episode there was no indication that any such occurrence had ever happened. However, it doesn't directly contradict anything already established about Neelix or his race, but there was nothing to indicate this either. However, the fact that Neelix's whole family was killed and his home planet was conquered does help explain why Neelix is on board a starship that is on a direct course away from his homeland and is a one-way trip where they never plan on returning from. However, this thick, dark backstory doesn't really seem to go well with Neelix's lighthearted demeanor, but on the other hand, some with lighthearted demeanors have, do this and behave this way in order to hide a darker, sadder core. So that in that case, it does kind of work, at least for this episode. And this backstory is acknowledged in later episodes when Neelix talks about how he lost his entire family, and in the 7th season episode where Neelix meets a group of Talaxians far away from their space that were fleeing the Harkonian oppression. So at least they were consistent with this backstory for the most part. So my rating for Jetrel out of 10 is a 10. The best. An absolutely amazing episode that relies on dialogue-based scenes to create some really powerful drama centered around a metaphor for the atomic bomb and weapons of mass destruction and the scientists that created it. And it tells this story from such a personal perspective that it really works, as it crafts an amazing character story for both Neelix and Jetrel, as Neelix must confront his own personal demons in order to be able to forgive Jetrel for what he's done. I may not think this episode is quite as good as Duet, as it sometimes is a bit too obvious that it was trying to emulate it, but I do feel this is a very effective and powerful episode in its own right. So that's it for my review of Jetrel. So I am taking a break from episode requests at the moment. I may take some more episode requests next year, maybe in April or May, but at the moment I am not taking any more episode requests for Star Trek, and this video marks the final of my pending requests. However, I still do plan on doing many more Star Trek videos in the coming months, as well as many other videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Vikings, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.